They thought the night belonged to money, marble, and men who had never once been told no. But before the last glass was cleared, that dining room was about to learn what dignity costs when the wrong woman is pushed too far. Ariana Brooks moved through Moretti's like she always did, quiet, graceful, nearly invisible if you did not know where to look. The crystal above her caught the amber light and scattered it across the polished walnut floors, over white linen, over diamond bracelets and gold watches and smiles too expensive to be sincere. She balanced a silver tray against one palm and kept her shoulders steady, even though her feet already ached inside black work shoes she had been wearing for 10 straight hours. Friday nights in downtown Chicago always felt longer inside Damian Moretti's flagship restaurant, where every plate looked like art and every whispered conversation carried the weight of money, secrets, or both. Ariana had learned to survive those nights by keeping her voice soft, her eyes lowered, and her emotions locked behind a calm expression no guest could read. It was safer that way. Safer for her, and safer for the man whose name was on the building, but whose name was never supposed to touch hers in public. Because no one in that room knew that the black waitress refilling their water glasses wore a diamond ring on a chain beneath her uniform, hidden under cotton and caution. No one knew that 3 months earlier, in the privacy of a penthouse wrapped in city lights, Damian Moretti had asked her to marry him with a voice so low it had shaken more than any shout ever could. And no one knew that Ariana had said yes with tears in her eyes and one condition in her heart. Let me keep my life until the danger around you settles down. Damian had agreed, though neither of them believed danger ever truly settled. That was why Ariana was still here in her fitted black button-down and pressed apron, carrying sparkling water to table 12 while the city's elite treated her like part of the decor. At 8:17 p.m., the room changed. It started with laughter, the wrong kind, loud and sharp enough to cut through piano music. 3 men in tailored suits sat in. A corner banquet, the kind of men who wore privilege like cologne and assumed every woman serving them existed for their amusement. One snapped his fingers before Ariana even reached the table. Another looked her up and down with the lazy contempt of someone who had never scrubbed a floor, stood on sore feet, or counted tips at 2 a.m. to decide whether groceries could wait. Ariana stopped beside them and offered the professional smile she had perfected years ago. Good evening, gentlemen. Can I refresh your drinks? The man closest to her leaned back, swirling the last inch of bourbon in his glass. His grin was smooth, mean, and almost bored. Depends, he said. Are you finally going to act like you know who you're serving? Ariana kept her voice even. I'm happy to help with anything on the menu, sir. That answer made the second man laugh harder. The third tapped ash from a cigar into an empty bread plate, even though smoking was not allowed in the dining room. Ariana glanced at the glowing tip, then at the nearby families trying not to stare. For 1 second, just one, she thought about walking away. But then she saw a young busboy freeze near the service station, his face tight with worry, and she knew if she stayed silent, these men would keep going until they humiliated someone weaker than she was willing to let them find. So she straightened, folded both hands around the tray, and spoke with a steadiness that did not match the pulse beating in her throat. I'm sorry, sir, but cigars aren't permitted in this section. And just like that, the air at table 12 went cold. Ariana had barely finished speaking when the man with the cigar lifted his eyes to her, as if she had committed some private offense by sounding educated, calm, and unafraid. For a moment, he did not answer. He only stared, the ember glowing between his fingers, while the soft piano from the corner of the room kept playing as if nothing had changed. Then he smiled, and somehow that smile felt worse than open anger. Around them, crystal chimed gently. Waiters crossed the floor with polished discipline, and the scent of seared steak and rosemary butter drifted through the warm golden air. Moretti's remained beautiful, almost painfully so, which made the ugliness gathering at table 12 feel even sharper. Ariana did not move. She had learned a long time ago that some men mistook flinching for permission. She kept the tray level, her shoulders square, and her voice respectful. Sir, I can have the patio prepared for you if you would prefer to finish your cigar there. The second man let out a laugh that turned heads at 2 nearby tables. Did you hear that? He said to his friends, leaning back against the leather banquette. She has options for us. The third man, the youngest of the 3, loosened his tie, and looked Ariana over with the lazy arrogance of someone used to making service workers uncomfortable for sport. "What is your name, sweetheart?" Ariana ignored the last word and answered only the question. "Ariana, sir." He repeated it slowly, as though testing whether her name belonged in his mouth. "Ariana. Pretty name for someone working a Friday night shift." The first man finally set the cigar down, not in the ashtray beside him, but on the edge of a bread plate, where a thin trail of smoke began to curl upward. His cufflinks caught the light when he folded his hands. "You know what your problem is, Ariana. You forgot your place." The words landed quietly, but the table beside them went still. Ariana felt it, the subtle shift that happens when strangers sense humiliation arriving and choose silence because silence costs them nothing. Across the room, a hostess froze with menus pressed against her chest. At the service station, the young busboy still had not moved. Ariana knew this kind of moment. It had happened in diners, hotel lounges, banquet halls, and country clubs, always wrapped in different clothes but carrying the same message. Some people did not mind being served. They only minded being corrected by the person doing the serving. She drew one slow breath and reminded herself of the rule she had lived by long before Damien entered her life. Finish the shift. Protect your peace. Walk away with your dignity still in your hands. "I am only trying to enforce restaurant policy," she said. "If there is a problem, I can bring the floor manager over right away." That was when the second man reached for the water glass she had just refilled and turned it lazily in a circle, watching the light move through it. "No," he said. "I think we would rather hear you explain why you thought you could embarrass us in front of the whole room." Ariana glanced around. Nobody had been looking before. Now everyone was pretending not to. She knew the script. The powerful humiliate in public, and the decent lower their eyes because intervening might make them next. She could already feel heat gathering at the base of her neck, but her voice remained steady. "I did not mean to embarrass anyone, sir. I only asked that the rules be respected." The youngest man let out a low whistle. "Rules." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, expensive watch gleaming beneath the chandelier. "Do you know whose city this is?" Ariana did know. She knew whose name was on the building, whose influence ran through half the downtown blocks, whose enemies watched shadows and doorways and cameras for weakness. She also knew that if Damien walked in right now and saw even a fraction of this, the night would change in ways none of these men were prepared for. That was exactly what she was trying to avoid. So she lowered the tray, kept her eyes level, and chose restraint over pride one more time. "I will send my manager," she said softly. But just as she turned, the first man spoke again, his voice cool and cruel enough to stop her in place. "No, you will stay right here. We are not finished with you yet." The room did not grow louder after that. It grew quieter, which was somehow worse. The piano still played near the bar, soft and elegant, but around table 12 the silence tightened like invisible wire. Ariana stood with the empty silver tray against her hip and felt every eye that refused to meet hers. She knew this kind of silence too. It was the silence of people who saw something wrong and decided it was safer to let it happen to someone else. The first man leaned back as if he had purchased the right to keep her standing there. The second lifted his bourbon and washed her over the rim of the glass. The youngest one smiled with a kind of careless cruelty that belonged to men who had mistaken access for power their entire lives. Ariana could have called for Marcus, the floor manager. She could have signaled security with one glance. Moretti's had systems for everything. But systems only worked when the people inside them had courage, and courage was in short supply when wealthy guests were involved. Marcus was already pretending to reorganize reservation slips at the host's stand, his face pale, his spine conveniently absent. He had seen enough to step in. He had chosen not to. That told Ariana everything she needed to know. She placed the tray on the edge of an empty service cart beside her and folded her hands in front of her apron so no one would see the slight tremor in her fingers. Years ago, her grandmother had taught her that dignity was not the same as comfort. Dignity meant standing upright even when the world was trying to bend you into something smaller. So Ariana stood. The first man studied her for another long second, then gave a dry little laugh. "There it is," he said. "That look again. Like you think you are better than this job." Ariana answered carefully. "No, sir. I believe every person deserves respect, including the people serving your dinner." The second man let out a low whistle, amused now in the cruel way bored men become when someone gives them resistance polished in courtesy. Listen to that. She has principles. The youngest man turned his head toward the others. I told you she was not the usual kind. She speaks like she went to college. He said it as though intelligence inside a black uniform were an offense against the natural order of the room. Ariana did not answer. She had learned another rule in places like this one. Once certain people realize they cannot make you rude, they try to make you ashamed instead. They ask where you are from, how you ended up here, whether someone like you should be grateful just to be allowed in the room. They peel at your dignity like children picking at loose thread, hoping the whole thing will unravel in their hands. The first man glanced at her name tag again. Ariana Brooks. Tell me, Miss Brooks, do you always correct paying customers, or are we getting special treatment tonight? There was laughter at that, low and smooth and ugly. Ariana kept her chin level. I treat every guest the same, sir. For the first time, the smile left his face. That answer did not flatter him. It diminished him, gently but unmistakably, by refusing to recognize the kind of hierarchy he expected from her. He drummed his fingers once against the tablecloth, then looked past Ariana toward the dining room entrance. A Blacktown car had just pulled up outside beneath the restaurant's awning, its polished surface catching the gold spill of the streetlights. The valet straightened at once. Two men in dark coats stepped out first, scanning the sidewalk with trained calm. Then a third figure emerged from the back seat, tall, composed, wrapped in a charcoal overcoat cut so perfectly it looked almost severe. Even from across the room, the energy shifted. Conversations dipped. A sommelier near the wine wall went still mid-step. Ariana felt it before she looked. That unmistakable change in the air, like the city itself had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Damien Moretti had arrived without warning. And at the exact same moment, the youngest man at table 12 followed her line of sight to the front entrance, smiled in a way that made her blood run cold, and said very softly, well now, this just got interesting. Damien did not hurry when he entered. Men like him never did. He moved through the front of the restaurant with the kind of calm that made other people adjust themselves without understanding why. His overcoat fell in a clean dark line past his knees. His silver watch caught one brief flash of chandelier light, and every person near the entrance lowered their voice by instinct. Ariana had seen that effect 100 times from a distance. Wealth could command attention. Fear could command silence. But Damien commanded something else entirely, something colder and harder to name, the kind of presence that made a room feel measured the moment he stepped inside it. He was supposed to be at a private meeting across town. He had told her that morning, with his hand resting lightly at the small of her back in the kitchen of his penthouse, that he would be tied up until late and that she should go home the minute her shift ended. She had smiled, straightened his tie, and promised him she would. Now he was here anyway, walking beneath amber light and polished brass, and Ariana felt two things at once, relief and dread, arriving together like twin storms. If Damien saw too much, the night would not remain a restaurant problem. It would become something far larger, something no apology could smooth over. At table 12, the three men noticed the shift in the room and mistook it for entertainment. The youngest one sat up straighter and glanced from Damien back to Ariana with open curiosity, as if he had been handed a front row seat to a show he did not yet understand. The first man reached for his cigar again, but did not light it. He only rolled it between two fingers and smiled. Do you know him, Miss Brooks? He asked, his tone light, needling, far too interested. Ariana kept her gaze level. He is the owner, sir. That answer was true and useless at the same time. The second man chuckled into his drink. Then perhaps you should tell him his staff could use a lesson in hospitality. Ariana did not respond. Across the room, Damien removed his gloves one finger at a time and handed them to the maitre d' without breaking stride. He said something low to one of the men who had come in with him, and the man peeled away toward the back corridor at once. Another remained a step behind Damien's shoulder, watchful, quiet, the kind of quiet that looked expensive and dangerous. Damien's eyes moved over the room in one slow sweep, not searching at first, simply taking inventory the way he always did. Then they found Ariana. The change in his face was almost invisible unless you knew him. His expression did not harden. It sharpened. His gaze dropped from her face to the untouched service cart beside her, to the three men seated too comfortably, to the thin line of smoke still curling from the bread plate, and then back to her hands folded a little too carefully at her waist. Damien knew her well enough to recognize restraint when he saw it. He knew the difference between her peace and her silence under pressure. For 1 second, Ariana thought he might walk straight toward her. Instead, he stopped near the center of the dining room as if reconsidering his path, and that hesitation frightened her more than immediate anger would have. Damien never hesitated unless he was choosing the most controlled response available to him. Marcus, the floor manager, suddenly appeared at last, summoned by courage that had arrived far too late. He crossed the floor too quickly, smile brittle, hands damp, trying to look useful now that the owner had entered. "Mr. Moretti, good evening," he said, voice a shade too bright. "We were not expecting you." Damien did not look at him right away. His eyes were still on Ariana. Then, very calmly, he asked a question so soft Marcus had to step closer to hear it. "Why is one of my best servers standing at a guest table with no manager present?" The room went still. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "There was a small misunderstanding, sir. Nothing serious." At table 12, the first man laughed under his breath as if Marcus had confirmed the whole matter was beneath concern. Ariana felt the floor tilt beneath the polished calm of the room. Because Damien had not raised his voice. He had not frowned. He had not moved. And that was exactly how she knew the night was about to cross a line no one in that restaurant could uncross. Marcus looked like a man trying to keep water from pouring through a cracked wall with nothing but his bare hands and a rehearsed smile. He straightened his jacket, glanced once at Ariana, and made the mistake of choosing the version of the truth that powerful people often prefer in the moment, the one polished enough to sound harmless. "Just a minor issue with guest service, sir," he said. "Miss Brooks may have spoken a little too firmly to one of our regulars." Ariana did not flinch, but something cold settled in her chest. There it was. Not what happened, but what could be made convenient. Damien turned his head slowly toward Marcus, and though his expression remained calm, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. A little too firmly, he repeated, as if testing the shape of the excuse. Marcus swallowed. The first man at table 12 leaned back in the leather banquette with renewed confidence, mistaking silence for victory. "It was a misunderstanding," he said smoothly, lifting one shoulder as though the matter hardly deserved discussion. "Your waitress forgot how to speak to paying customers." Damien's gaze shifted to him at last. The man had the polished face of old money and the lazy ease of someone who had lived too long without consequence. Beside him, the second man rotated his bourbon glass in slow circles, while the youngest sat forward with a bright, ugly curiosity, already enjoying the tension more than the meal. Damien took one step closer to the table, not enough to seem aggressive, only enough to make Marcus retreat half a pace without realizing he had done it. "What exactly did she say?" Damien asked. The first man smiled. "She informed us that our cigar was not welcome and then suggested we move." His tone made courtesy sound like insolence. Damien said nothing. He looked to Ariana. She knew that look. It was never only a question. It was an invitation to trust him with the truth. And that was exactly what terrified her. Because the truth in Damien's world never remained small for long. She kept her voice even. "I asked that house policy be respected, and I offered them another section, sir." Damien held her gaze for one brief second more, and in that second, he understood far more than she had said. He saw the control in her posture, the careful stillness in her hands, the fact that she was answering him like an employee while wearing the ring he had given her hidden on a chain beneath her shirt. He also saw something else, the detail no one else in the room seemed to value. Ariana was not embarrassed. She was containing the embarrassment others had tried to place on her. That mattered to him more than Marcus could possibly understand. The second man gave a short laugh. "You make it sound noble when she says it." Damien did not look away from Ariana when he answered. Respect should not require decoration to sound convincing. That line landed like a blade wrapped in velvet. The table beside them went still again. A woman in pearls sat down. Her fork. Near the bar, a bartender stopped drying a stemmed glass and forgot to resume. The youngest man's smile flickered for the first time. Damien finally turned fully toward table 12. "Gentlemen," he said, voice smooth and low, "if my employee addressed a policy violation, then she was doing her job." The first man's mouth tightened. "Now hold on." We were having a private dinner, and your girl made it public. Your girl. The phrase hung there for half a second too long. Ariana felt it before Damien moved, not physically, but inwardly, a subtle closing of distance behind his eyes. He reached for the back of an empty chair and rested one hand on it, the picture of restraint. Do not refer to her like that again, he said. Nobody breathed. Marcus stared at the floor. The second man set his drink down too hard against the linen, then forced a laugh as though the whole exchange were still salvageable. We did not realize the owner was so personally invested in the waitstaff. That was the closest anyone in the room had come to the truth, and yet even then they did not understand what they were touching. Ariana's pulse began to beat harder, not from fear for herself now, but from the terrible certainty that the night was moving toward the one revelation she had spent months helping Damien avoid. Because if these men pushed one step further, if they reached for one more insult, one more smug little cruelty, the line between waitress and woman he loved was going to disappear right there under the chandeliers, in front of everyone. Ariana knew that look in Damien's eyes better than anyone alive, and that was exactly why fear rose so sharply inside her now. To everyone else in the restaurant, he still looked composed, still looked like a powerful owner correcting a problem on the floor with measured authority. But Ariana had seen him in quieter places, on sleepless nights above the city when his guard slipped for half a second, when old grief and old loyalty and old fury moved beneath his calm like currents under black water. She knew the difference between his patience and the thin, dangerous stillness that came when he was deciding how much mercy a room deserved. And Table 12, with its polished shoes and easy cruelty and careless entitlement, was using up that mercy by the second. The first man smiled again, though less confidently now. It was the smile of someone who had spent his life believing money could smooth over every offense, especially the ones committed against people he considered smaller than himself. You are taking this rather seriously, he said. Damien's hand remained on the empty chair. I take the conduct inside my establishment seriously. The second man leaned back and spread his hands as if he were the injured party. Then perhaps you should train your staff to recognize tone. We came here for a quiet evening, not a lecture from someone carrying water glasses. Ariana felt the words land around the room like little drops of acid, quiet but corrosive. A woman at a nearby table lowered her gaze to her plate. The bartender resumed polishing the same glass, though his hand had not moved in 30 seconds. Marcus stood frozen, trapped between self-preservation and shame, and choosing the first one again with every passing moment. Damien turned slightly toward Ariana, not enough to expose anything private, only enough that she could see the question behind his calm. He was asking without asking whether she wanted him to end this now. Ariana answered with the smallest shake of her head, so slight no one else would have noticed it. Please, not here. Please, not like this. For one suspended breath, she thought he might ignore her. Then something shifted in his face, subtle but real. Damien straightened from the chair and smoothed one hand over the front of his coat. Very well, he said. Since there seems to be confusion, let me clarify something. Every employee in this restaurant is under my protection while they are on this floor. They are not props. They are not targets for mockery. And they are certainly not required to accept disrespect in exchange for a tip. His voice never rose, yet the words reached every corner of the room. The first man's expression hardened. Now you are making this theatrical. No, Damien said softly. You did that the moment you mistook courtesy for weakness. The youngest man, who had been studying Ariana with far too much interest, finally leaned forward. What is so special about her, then? That question should not have changed the room, but it did. Ariana felt her pulse jump. Marcus looked up too quickly. Even the pianist at the far corner missed a note, the sound hanging in the air like a crack in glass. Damien did not answer at once. His gaze moved to Ariana, and in that brief silence an entire private world seemed to stand between them. Hidden dinners after midnight, his jacket over her shoulders in the penthouse kitchen, the ring he had slipped into her palm before placing it on a chain because safety mattered more than celebration. Ariana wanted to protect that world. It was the one thing in her life that belonged only to love and not to spectacle. So before Damien could speak, she stepped in with the only shield she had left. Sir, she said to Marcus, I would like to be reassigned. I can finish my shift in the back if needed. Marcus blinked. relieved to hear any solution that might let him escape the moment. Yes, of course, that can be arranged. But the first man laughed, sharp and dismissive. No, I do not think so. He looked directly at Ariana, and the contempt in his eyes had turned personal now, as though her dignity itself offended him. We are not done here. And this time, when he reached across the edge of the table as if to stop her from leaving, Damien moved before anyone else in the room even remembered how to breathe. Damien's hand closed around the man's wrist before his fingers ever reached Ariana's sleeve, and the movement was so fast, so precise, that half the room did not understand what had happened until the man's chair scraped softly against the floor. Damien did not squeeze hard enough to create a scene. He did not need to. Authority had always lived more naturally in him than noise. He simply held the wrist away from Ariana, as if removing something offensive from the table, his expression unreadable, his voice low enough that everyone leaned inward to catch it. You will not touch her. The first man froze. The second set his glass down with a dull click against the linen. The youngest one straightened in his seat, all amusement gone now, replaced by the first thin edge of uncertainty. Ariana felt the room tilt around that single sentence. Not do not touch my staff. Not do not touch employees. Her. Too personal. Too direct. Too revealing. Damien released the man's wrist with controlled disgust, and the silence that followed was no longer the silence of social discomfort. It was the silence of people sensing they had wandered into a truth too large for the setting. Marcus looked as if he wanted to disappear into the walnut paneling. Near the bar, one of the servers forgot the tray in her hands until a champagne flute gave a tiny nervous rattle. Ariana could feel every heartbeat in her throat. Damien had not exposed everything yet, but the door was open now. One more sentence, one more look, and the private life they had guarded so carefully would spill across the dining room floor for strangers to dissect. She stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Sir, I am fine, she said, keeping her voice calm though her pulse was not. Please, let me handle this. Damien turned his head slightly toward her, and for one aching instant the whole restaurant vanished for both of them. She saw the conflict inside his stillness, the man who had promised to protect her at any cost, and the man trying with all his strength to honor the boundaries she had asked for. Months earlier, in the quiet gold light of his penthouse kitchen, Ariana had made him one promise and one request. She would marry him. But until the threats around him cooled, until rival eyes stopped searching for the weakest place to strike, she wanted the world to keep seeing her as ordinary. Let me keep one corner of my life untouched, she had said. Damien had kissed her forehead and agreed, though even then his eyes had carried the look of a man making peace with something he hated. And now here they stood, with that promise fraying under chandelier light. The first man rubbed his wrist and forced a smile that no longer reached his eyes. This is absurd, he said. We are being treated like criminals over a misunderstanding with a waitress. The word waitress landed differently now. It was no longer dismissive. It was probing. Testing. The youngest man's gaze flicked from Damien to Ariana and back again, sharper than before. He was putting pieces together, not the whole truth perhaps, but enough to make danger stir at the edges of the room. There are no misunderstandings here, Damien said. Only choices. You chose arrogance. You chose disrespect. And now you will choose whether this night ends with dignity or humiliation. The second man gave a brittle laugh. Is that a threat? Damien's expression did not change. It is an opportunity. For one brief moment, Ariana thought they might take it. The oldest man looked away first, toward the nearest exit, toward the curious faces pretending not to watch, toward the check folders still unopened near the candle. Shame had finally touched him, or at least self-interest dressed as shame. He drew a breath, perhaps to stand, perhaps even to leave. But the youngest ruined it. He leaned back, folded one arm over the back of the banquette, and smiled directly at Ariana with a recklessness that made her stomach drop. I see, he said softly. She is not just anyone to you. That was when the side door near the service hallway opened and a teenage busboy named Luis emerged carrying a stack of dessert plates. Too young, too unaware, too close to the tension gathering at table 12. Ariana saw him at once. She also saw the youngest man reach inside his jacket, not with clarity, not with certainty, but with enough wrong intention in the movement to send ice through her blood. And in the split second before anyone else in the room understood why she moved, Ariana stepped away from Damien and toward the boy. Everything after that seemed to happen in a strange, stretched silence, as if the restaurant itself had lost track of time. Luis stepped out from the service hallway with a stack of dessert plates balanced carefully in both hands, his black apron still too long for his thin frame, his face carrying the tired concentration of a 17-year-old trying very hard not to make mistakes in a room built for people who noticed everything. He had no idea what he was walking into. He only saw table 12, the open lane between the banquette and the service station, and Ariana standing suddenly in his path with a look he had never seen on her face before. Ariana did not think. She reacted. 1 second she was beside Damien, feeling the pressure of the room gather around that terrible little movement from the youngest man. The next, she was moving toward Luis with her hand outstretched, her voice breaking through the heavy stillness for the first time that night. "Luis, stop." Her warning came sharp and clear enough to cut through the piano, through the clink of silver, through the false elegance the room had been using to hide its rot. The boy froze exactly where he was, dessert plates trembling in his hands. Damien moved at the same instant, one swift step forward, his entire focus narrowing with lethal precision. But Ariana had already crossed the distance between herself and the danger she sensed. She reached Luis first, turning her body toward him, shielding him with the same instinct that had made her endure insult after insult all evening rather than let ugliness spill onto someone younger, poorer, more vulnerable. The plates slipped from Luis's hands and struck the carpeted floor with a muffled, expensive crash. A woman near the window gasped. Someone else stood too quickly, knocking a chair backward. The youngest man at table 12 was halfway out of his seat now, his hand still inside his jacket, his expression no longer amused, no longer superior, but panicked in the way weak men often become when they realize they have gone too far and do not know how to retreat with dignity. Then came a sharp sound that did not belong in a dining room. Not loud, not cinematic, just wrong. Wrong enough to tear through crystal light and candle glow and leave the whole restaurant suspended in disbelief. Ariana flinched. Luis cried out and dropped to his knees, covering his head with both arms. The room shattered into movement without anyone fully understanding why. Chairs scraped. Glass tipped. A server near the bar screamed once and then clapped both hands over her mouth. Marcus stumbled backward into the host's stand. Damien reached Ariana just as her balance failed her, catching her before she could hit the floor, one arm around her shoulders, the other steady and sure at her waist. Her breath came shallow with shock more than pain, her eyes unfocused for a half second, as if her mind was trying to reject what the night had become. Damien looked down at her, and something inside him seemed to go utterly still. Not the stillness of patience, not the stillness of control, something deeper, more dangerous. He lowered her carefully onto one knee with a gentleness that did not belong to the reputation the city had built around his name. Ariana's fingers found his sleeve and held on, not because she was weak, but because she knew him, and she knew what would happen if the next few seconds belonged only to his rage. Luis was sobbing that he was sorry. Guests were backing away in horror. The men at table 12 no longer looked rich. They looked small. Damien lifted his head slowly, his face emptied of every trace of public civility, and in a voice so quiet the whole room had to lean into its fear to hear it, he gave the order that changed everything. Lock the doors. The doors clicked shut one by one with soft mechanical certainty, and that sound did more to change the room than any raised voice could have. Conversations died mid-breath. A woman near the window clutched her husband's sleeve with both hands. The pianist had stopped playing without anyone noticing exactly when. Even the candles seemed to burn more quietly now, their reflections trembling in crystal and polished silver as fear spread from table to table like cold through glass. Damien remained on one knee beside Ariana, one arm steady around her shoulders, his dark coat pooling against the patterned carpet, his face carved into something so controlled it no longer looked human to the people watching. That was the part that terrified them most. Not anger, not noise, the absence of both. Ariana's fingers still held a fold of his sleeve, light but deliberate, as if even through the shock of the moment, she was asking him for one last impossible thing. Stay calm. Stay with me. Damien bent close enough that only she could hear him. "Look at me," he said softly. "Stay with me, Ariana." Her eyes found his. She drew a careful breath and nodded once. She was pale now, shaken, but conscious, and Damien's expression shifted by a fraction when he saw that. Relief did not warm him. It only sharpened his focus. Behind him, two of his men moved through the dining room with disciplined speed, guiding guests away from the center of the floor, clearing space, removing panic from the edges before panic could turn into chaos. Marcus stood rooted near the host's stand, his lips moving without sound, while Luis had curled against the service station, crying in stunned bursts, still too young to understand how close the night had come to swallowing him whole. Table 12 looked different now. Wealth had drained out of it, leaving only 3 men in expensive suits who had mistaken status for immunity and discovered too late that they had entered the wrong room with the wrong kind of arrogance. The youngest stared at Damien as though seeing him for the first time. The first man tried to gather what remained of his composure and failed. The second was the one who broke first. "This was an accident," he said, voice cracking at the edges. Nobody meant for any of this to happen. Damien did not even look at him. "Bring the medic," he said, and one of his men was already moving. Then, with extraordinary care, Damien reached beneath Ariana's collar and drew the chain he knew was hidden there. It slid free against the black fabric of her uniform, fine gold catching the chandelier light. At the center of it hung the ring. A clean oval diamond, elegant, unmistakable, no longer private. Gasps moved across the room like a wind through leaves. Marcus closed his eyes. The woman in pearls pressed a hand to her mouth. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," and then wished they had not said anything at all. Damien let the ring rest against Ariana's chest for one suspended second, as if the whole room deserved to see what they had failed to respect before they understood its value. When he finally rose to his full height, he did not release her hand. That was the detail people would remember later. Not just the locked doors or the silence or the fear. The way the most untouchable man in the city stood in the center of his own restaurant. Holding the hand of the black waitress they had all been willing to let humiliate alone. His gaze lifted to table 12. "You thought she was unprotected," he said. His voice was still quiet, but every word landed with the weight of judgment. "You thought her dignity cost less because she wore an apron. You thought silence from this room meant permission." No one answered. No one dared. Damien looked at Marcus next, and Marcus seemed to shrink inside his suit. "You saw it happening," Damien said, "and you did nothing." Marcus opened his mouth to apologize, but Damien had already moved past him. Then his eyes returned to the 3 men. One of them tried to stand straighter. Another tried to speak. The youngest, the one who had smiled with reckless curiosity only minutes earlier, looked at the ring and finally understood the full measure of what he had done. Damien's voice lost even the last trace of warmth. "Tonight," he said, "you will learn the difference between serving power and belonging to it." And the room went silent in a way it had not before, because everyone there understood that what came next was no longer about a disturbance in a restaurant. It was a reckoning. No one moved after that. The restaurant had become something else entirely, no longer a place of polished service and quiet luxury, but a courtroom built from candlelight, crystal, and shame. Damien stood at the center of it holding Ariana's hand, while one of his medics knelt beside her, speaking in calm, measured tones, checking what needed checking, making certain she remained steady. Ariana's breathing had evened, but the strain still showed in the tightness around her eyes. Even now, even with the ring exposed and the truth hanging in the air like thunder waiting to break, her first instinct was not for herself. It was for Luis. She turned her head slightly, found the trembling busboy by the service station, and whispered, "Is he all right?" The medic looked up at Damien, but Damien answered her himself. "He is safe," he said softly. "Because of you." Something in the room shifted when people heard that. Not just fear now. Recognition. The black waitress they had watched endure insult with quiet. Professionalism had moved first to protect someone younger and more vulnerable than herself. She had done it without calculation, without status, without needing anyone to know who loved her. That truth landed harder than the ring had. The woman in pearls lowered her eyes. The bartender looked openly ashamed. Marcus seemed unable to lift his head at all. Damien released Ariana's hand only long enough to remove his coat and place it gently around her shoulders, covering the black uniform they had all mistaken for weakness. Then he rose and turned to face the room. His men remained near the doors, silent and immovable. Table 12 sat in the center of a silence none of those men could buy their way out of. The first man tried again, voice thinner now, stripped of polish. "Mr. Moretti, this has gone too far for a misunderstanding." Damien looked at him as if the sentence itself were offensive. "No," he said. "It went too far when you believed a woman doing her job could be humiliated for your entertainment. It went further when my management watched and chose convenience over courage. And it crossed its final line when recklessness entered a room where innocent people were working." He did not shout. He did not need to. Every word carried the weight of a verdict. He turned first to Marcus. "You are done here. Effective immediately. Not because you failed a policy, but because you failed a human being standing 10 feet from you while she was being degraded in your care." Marcus's face drained of what little color remained. He nodded once, as if he knew any defense would only make him smaller. Damien then looked toward the rest of the staff, his voice still calm, but different now, less like judgment and more like law being written in real time. "From this night forward, no employee in any Moretti establishment will ever be asked to tolerate humiliation in silence for the comfort of a paying guest. Any manager who confuses profit with permission will leave the same way Marcus is leaving." Heads lifted around the room. A server near the bar began to cry quietly, not from fear, but from the shock of hearing someone powerful say aloud what working people are almost never told: that their dignity mattered before the customer's money did. Then Damien's gaze returned to table 12, and whatever fragile hope had begun to form in those men died instantly. "You will apologize," he said. "Not to me, to her." The first man opened his mouth, pride and panic warring visibly inside him. The second stared at the tablecloth. The youngest looked at Ariana, then at the ring, and seemed to understand for the first time that he had not simply misjudged a situation. He had revealed the poverty of his own character in a room full of witnesses. Ariana looked up from the medic's side, still pale, still shaken, but steady. And when the first man finally stood, voice trembling as he forced the word sorry past a lifetime of arrogance, the room did not feel satisfied. It felt changed. The apology did not come easily, and that was precisely why everyone in the room heard it for what it was worth. The first man stood with the stiffness of someone unaccustomed to bowing his head for anyone, least of all a woman he had dismissed minutes earlier as part of the furniture. His jaw tightened once, then again, as if his pride were fighting for one last useless breath. "Miss Brooks," he said, voice rough and uneven, "I was out of line." The words sounded foreign in his mouth, but they were there, real enough to alter the air. The second man followed more quietly, unable to lift his eyes above the edge of the table. The youngest waited longest, his face pale now, his arrogance cracked open and showing something smaller underneath. When he finally spoke, he did not sound defiant. He sounded ashamed. "I am sorry," he said. "I should never have spoken to you that way." Ariana listened without triumph. That was what unsettled people most about her. She had every reason to make the moment bitter, every reason to let humiliation return to the men who had tried to force it on her. But cruelty had never interested her, not even when justice did. She sat straighter beneath Damien's coat, one hand lightly gripping the fabric near her collarbone, the hidden ring now resting in plain sight against the dark cloth. For a moment she said nothing. The chandeliers threw soft light across her face, catching the strain still there, but also the steadiness. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and clear enough to reach the edges of the room. "Respect should not begin only after someone powerful claims me." The sentence landed deeper than any accusation could have. The first man looked down. The woman in pearls closed her eyes. Near the bar, one of the servers let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob. Because that was the truth none of them could escape now. Ariana had deserved respect before the ring, before Damien, before fear entered the room and forced a reckoning. She had deserved it when she was only a waitress in their eyes. Damien turned to look at her then, and something in him softened with unmistakable force. Not weakness. Never that. Something rarer. Reverence. For all his power, for all the men who moved when he spoke and the doors that opened because his name existed, Ariana still had the ability to say one quiet sentence and leave him feeling like he was the one being taught. He crouched beside her again, lowering himself without hesitation onto the expensive carpet as though none of the city's invisible rules applied when it came to her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and this time there was no effort to keep tenderness out of his voice. The whole room heard it. Ariana looked at him and managed the faintest smile, tired but real. "Better than you look," she said. A few startled laughs slipped out of the guests before they could stop themselves, small and shaky and human. Even Damien's mouth changed, just barely, a shadow of a smile touched with relief. The medic finished checking her and gave a discreet nod. She needed rest, nothing more urgent. But Damien still looked as though he might carry the entire city on his back if it meant she would not have to take another unsteady step tonight. Luis had stopped crying by then. He stood near the service station with red eyes and trembling hands, staring at Ariana, as if he had just discovered that courage did not always arrive in a uniform or with a title. "I am sorry, Miss Brooks," he whispered. "I should have stayed back." Ariana turned toward him at once. "No, Luis," she said. "You did. Nothing wrong. Remember that." Her voice gained strength as she said it, not only for him, but for every worker in the room who had ever been told to shrink themselves for somebody else's comfort. "You did your job. That is all you were ever supposed to do." Damien rose slowly and looked across the restaurant one last time. Guests stood quieter now, not because they feared him, though they did, but because they had been made to witness something they could not unsee. Money had failed the test. Status had failed the test. Only character remained. Damien slipped one arm carefully around Ariana's shoulders and helped her to her feet. "This evening is over," he said. The dining room would be closed. Transportation would be arranged. Staff would be paid for the full shift. No one argued. No one questioned him. As he guided Ariana toward the private exit, the room parted without instruction. And for the first time that night, people did not look at her as though she belonged to the man beside her. They looked at her as if they finally understood that he was the one honored by hers. The private exit closed behind them with a muted click, and for the first time that night the noise of the restaurant fell away completely. The hallway beyond was lined with dark walnut, soft recessed lighting, and framed black and white photographs of old Chicago, but Ariana barely noticed any of it. The adrenaline that had kept her standing under chandeliers and strangers' eyes was fading now, leaving only exhaustion in its place. Damien felt the shift the moment it happened. His arm tightened around her shoulders, steady and careful, guiding her through the corridor as though the floor itself had become something fragile beneath her feet. He did not speak until they reached the elevator reserved for family and senior staff, and even then his voice was low, stripped of every hard edge he had worn in the dining room. "You should not have had to survive that," he said. Ariana leaned lightly against the wall once the elevator doors slid shut. The mirrored panel opposite them reflected an image neither of them had ever planned to show the world this way, her in a black server uniform wrapped in his coat, the ring no longer hidden, him standing too close and too protective to pretend this was anything but love exposed under pressure. She looked at their reflection for a long second before answering. No one there should have had to watch it happen either. Damien closed his eyes once, briefly, as if that answer wounded him in a place anger could not reach. That was Ariana. Even shaken, even tired, she still widened the frame beyond herself. She still found the human cost in every room. When the elevator opened into the underground garage, a black SUV was already waiting. His driver stood by the rear door, and one of Damien's men kept a respectful distance near the concrete pillar, speaking quietly into an earpiece. The city beyond the garage entrance glittered in cold white and amber, traffic sliding past in thin ribbons beneath the spring night sky. Damien helped Ariana into the back seat and got in beside her instead of taking the front the way he often did when security protocols mattered more than comfort. Tonight, nothing mattered more than staying close enough to hear her breathing. During the drive, he made 3 calls, each one brief, precise, and final. The restaurant would remain closed for the weekend. Every employee on shift would receive full pay plus additional compensation. Luis would have access to counseling, tuition support if he wanted it, and the option to transfer to any Moretti property with no penalty. The guests who had witnessed the scene would receive apologies for the disruption, but not a single apology would be offered for the stand Damien had taken. That part, he made very clear, was not under review. Ariana listened in silence. watching the city lights pass across the window in streaks of gold and white. When he ended the last call, she turned to him. "You are changing everything because of one night." Damien looked at her as though the statement itself were too small. "No," he said. "I am changing everything because one night revealed what should have been changed long ago." That answer stayed with her all the way to the penthouse. Upstairs, the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. The house manager had discreetly dismissed the evening staff, leaving only warm light in the kitchen and a tray with tea, water, and the first aid supplies the medic had recommended. Damien helped Ariana onto the long cream-colored sofa overlooking Lake Michigan, then knelt in front of her to remove her shoes with the same care he might have given something sacred. It was such an ordinary act that it almost undid her. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Damien looked up immediately. "Ariana." She shook her head once and pressed her lips together, but the tears came anyway, not dramatic, not loud, just the quiet release of someone who had held herself together too long because other people needed her strength more than she did. Damien rose and sat beside her, then drew her gently against him until her forehead rested at his shoulder. "You do not have to be brave anymore tonight," he murmured. She let herself lean into that. For a long time neither of them spoke. The city lights moved over the lake like scattered coins. Finally Ariana lifted her head and touched the chain at her neck, the one that no longer held a secret. "It is over now," she said softly. "The hiding part." Damien's gaze settled on the ring resting against her fingers. "Yes," he said. And this time there was no regret in it, only certainty. Tomorrow the papers would hear rumors. Staff would talk. The city would stitch together its own version of what had happened inside Moretti's. But none of that mattered in the quiet of that room. What mattered was simpler. Ariana had walked into the night as someone expected to endure disrespect in silence, and she had walked out having changed the rules for everyone who would come after her. Damien reached for her hand and turned the ring slowly between his thumb and forefinger, his expression unreadable for one beat, then unexpectedly soft. "When I asked you to marry me," he said, "I thought I was promising to protect you from my world." He looked into her eyes then, completely unguarded. "I did not understand that you were going to force my world to become better in order to deserve you." Morning arrived over Chicago in silver light, pale and clean across the water. But nothing about the city felt the same. News traveled the way it always did around powerful men, not in one official statement, but in whispers through kitchens, back offices, loading docks, and private dining rooms. By noon, every Moretti property in the city knew some version of the story. They knew a waitress had been humiliated in the flagship restaurant. They knew the owner had shut the room down. They knew a manager had lost his position before the dessert course was even cleared. And by the end of the day, they knew the woman at the center of it was not just someone Damien Moretti loved in secret. She was the reason an entire system had been forced to look at itself in the mirror. Ariana stood the next afternoon in the penthouse dressing room while sunlight poured through tall windows and touched the soft cream walls. She was no longer wearing black service clothes or an apron. She wore a simple ivory dress that fell just below her knees, elegant and quiet. And for the first time in months the ring was no longer hidden on a chain. It rested where it belonged, on her hand, catching light every time she moved. Damien stood behind her, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit, watching her reflection with the kind of stillness that meant emotion ran deeper than words could comfortably reach. Today was not a gala, not a press conference, not some grand performance for the city's elite. It was something more deliberate than that. He had called a meeting at Moretti's before reopening the restaurant, and every member of staff from the flagship location had been invited, from servers and dishwashers to hosts and line cooks. Ariana had asked whether her presence would make things harder for them. Damien had answered with one sentence. "Your presence is the point." When they arrived, the restaurant looked different in daylight. The chandeliers were dimmed. The candlelight was gone. Without the glow of evening and expensive distraction, the room felt less like a palace and more like what it had always truly been, a workplace built from polished surfaces and human labor. Staff stood in small clusters, nervous, uncertain, whispering until Damien entered with Ariana beside him. Then the room fell quiet. No one looked at her, as though she were invisible now. Louise stood near the front in a pressed white shirt, eyes brighter than they had been the night before. Marcus was gone. Table 12 sat empty, stripped of linens, as if the room itself refused to forget what had happened there. Damien spoke first, briefly, clearly, with no ornament. He told them that every employee in every Moretti business would now have the power to refuse service in the face of abuse without risking pay or position. He announced mandatory management retraining, a direct reporting line that bypassed supervisors entirely, and a staff protection policy written not in legal language meant to shield the business, but in plain language meant to shield the people inside it. Then he stepped back. The room waited. Ariana had not planned to speak long, but when she looked at the faces before her, tired faces, careful faces, faces used to working through disrespect because rent was due and dignity rarely paid enough to matter to employers, she understood that silence would waste the moment. So she told them the truth. She told them she had stayed quiet too often in too many places because surviving had felt more urgent than being seen. She told them that courage did not always look loud, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was believe they were worth defending before anyone else proved it. And when she finished, no one clapped at first. The room simply stood there, absorbing it. Then Louise started. One pair of hands. Then another. Then the whole room. Not the applause given to status, money, or fear, but the kind given when people recognize themselves inside someone else's dignity and realize it has been theirs all along. Damien did not interrupt it. He only watched Ariana with that same quiet reverence, as if the entire city had been rearranged around a truth he should have understood sooner. Later, after the staff had gone and the restaurant stood calm again, he took her hand beside the front windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. Outside, traffic moved, horns sounded, people hurried past without knowing how much had shifted inside those walls. Damien lifted her hand, the one with the ring, and pressed his lips gently to her knuckles. "They feared you once they learned you belonged to me," he said. Ariana met his eyes, steady as ever. "No," she answered softly. "They learned too late that I belonged to myself first." Damien smiled then, small and real, the kind of smile only she ever drew from him. And that day, in a room once built to hide class, power, and humiliation beneath polished beauty, the world remembered what dignity looks like.